Szanowni Państwo, będziemy powoli zaczynać nasz...
And let's slowly but surely start our third panel. Third today, but fourth in general. What will the Third World War look like is the title. Announcing the conference and inviting you, we told you it would be a highly speculative panel because forecasting is difficult, especially when it comes to the future. Nonetheless, our guests, I'm hoping, will be helping us imagine things in terms of the different scenarios that may play out in the future. We will first hear from Ulrike Esther Franke, a PhD doctor of Oxford University, expert on war technology, terrorism, and foreign policy. She's currently working in the European Council on Foreign Relations. Later in the discussion, we will hear from Dr. Patrycja Sasnal, whom you quite well know, I'm sure, and Arab Studies expert working for the Polish Institute of International Affairs. She's a political commentator, and Ziemowit Szczerek, an author of a novel and essays and reportage on alternative history. The Victorious Republic is the working title, or is the working translation of the Polish title. And he focuses on this region to the east and to the south of Poland. So, let me give the floor to Ulrike Esther Franke.
Thank you very much. Sorry. So first of all, I think it's absolutely wonderful that some 72 years after the end of the Second World War, you invite to Poland a German to talk about World War III. So thank you very much for that. And I think it's a great sign of how far we've come as European countries and as the European Union. So, yeah, topic that rather isn't fun, right? Third World War, and I'm very sorry that we are closing our conference with that. But of course it's important to talk about war because it is the worst case scenario of any political confrontation, and we certainly have enough political confrontations at the moment. So I thought I'll focus on the how question more as on the why question. So I'm going to look at how a Third World War could play out, and maybe in the discussion, since we've got regional experts here, we can talk more about the where could it start kind of thing, which is also very uplifting. Right, but let me maybe start with a few words about predicting war in general, because as was mentioned, predicting the future is always hard, and predicting war is basically impossible. War really is never quite as anticipated, and often it is completely different. I mean, think about the Cold War. Throughout the Cold War, the Western militaries spent, all their time preparing for nuclear confrontation and for conventional confrontation on the German plains. And they bought their defense equipment that way, and they trained the soldiers that way. And as we know, luckily, this never came to be. However, while the militaries were preparing for that, they weren't preparing for interventionist forces. They weren't preparing to fight smaller, asymmetric wars and conflicts all over the world, which is, of course, what they ended up doing. They absolutely weren't prepared for that. So not only is making predictions about the future generally difficult, it gets much worse when you think about technology. And, we all think about World War III, I assume, about something super high tech. And we as a generation are very much used to technology improving all the time. And so we think of World War III being fought with technologies that aren't even invented yet. But that's obviously difficult to forecast. And particularly when it comes to technological progress, history really is riddled with false prophecies, either exaggerations or understatements. So we had various claims about, this technology now once and for all is going to end war. We had this about the telegraph, we had this about nuclear weapons, we had this about all kinds of things, and obviously that never came to be. But at the same time, you also have technological predictions that are totally wrong the other way. This kind of famous prediction by Watson saying there's probably a market of like 5 computers in the world. Well, that wasn't true either. Okay, so a lot of the time we get it wrong. Nevertheless, that absolutely does not keep us from trying. And actually we try a lot. So I don't know whether you noticed, but particularly in the US, they publish so many global visions, technological vectors, global trends, all these kinds of speculative documents to find out what the future of war could look like. And this goes so far that Robert Gates, who was defense minister or secretary of defense in the US a while back, he actually complained that the US, contrary to common belief, wasn't so much trying to fight the last war, which is kind of saying. They are focused so much on the future war that they were neglecting the current wars that they were fighting. So, very much this view into the future. So why are we trying to do this anyway? If we're wrong so many times, and most of the time, why are we trying to do this? And there are really 2 kind of easy, obvious answers. And the first, of course, is that, warfare is important because it is the worst possible outcome of political confrontation, so we need to prepare for this. But much more immediately, and maybe a bit more mundane, we need to have a vision because we need to spend our defense budgets. When you think about it, the developed world spends between 1% and 5% of GDP on defense, and they buy stuff, they train soldiers, they need to know how to do this. And this is where these scenarios come from, because people want to know, how do we do this best? Okay, and so just one final word before I come to this, how is it going to look like? Just as a general recommendation, don't discount fiction and don't discount science fiction when it comes to predicting the future and predicting warfare. And I'm really pleased that we have a writer here today on this panel. Maybe he can say something about this. Because a lot of the time, authors or thinkers that think about the future, they venture into science fiction simply because it gives them more space to think things through without being ridiculed. And we've got a lot of examples of that. So H.G. Wells, for instance, important author, War of the Worlds, you may know. So he thought a lot about the future and future warfare and wrote a lot of non-fiction accounts on that. But he also wrote a piece on the war in the air in about 1907, I think. It came out, and that was a fictional account about how a Third World War could be fought in the air. And it's extremely interesting to read. He predicted this to happen somewhere in the 1910s. Of course, there was a world war in that decade, although air power didn't play such a big role as it did in the Second World War. But yeah, as a general recommendation, read science fiction. Also, I've got lots of recommendations if you want some. I'm happy to give you some after my talk. Okay, so let's talk about World War III. And I'm very much presenting one fictional account here. It can look very different, but I tried to focus on a few important elements that I thought could give us food for thought. Okay, so the first hour of World War III. First of all, there won't be a first hour. There probably won't even be a first day. I think that when the history of the Third World War is being written, future historians will have major difficulties identifying the moment when the war started. I mean, first of all, there will be no declaration of war. We haven't done declaration of war for decades now. But more importantly, I think this war will start with months and months of disinformation, misinformation campaigns, the beginning of which we are, of course, already seeing today. Adverse powers will aim to make the population of their adversaries question the veracity of their media and their political leaders. And they will sow disinformation through the internet, but honestly, this isn't completely new. This is classic propaganda. The internet just makes it easier. Secondly, they will try and divide their enemy societies most likely by using their own nationals that live in these countries. And this is kind of the dark side of globalization, as much as I'm in favor of globalization, but this is where globalization may come back to haunt us, because immigrant societies are likely to be instrumentalized and weaponized in these kind of conflicts and will aim to destabilize the societies they live in. So the combatants in these early war months or pre-war period, however you want to call it, will be immigrants, trolls, journalists, and this is something that's certainly going to continue throughout the war. Like this whole misinformation, disinformation campaign, this is going to be a continuous throughout the war. And then the third important group in this early pre-war period, they will be unofficial combatants. And of course, this is something we've seen in Ukraine. This is the kind of little green men kind of thing, where you're going to have skirmishes and conflicts, but you aren't really sure who's really fighting. Is it your own people? Is it civil war? Are these official soldiers? Yes or no? A lot of uncertainty. And this is probably going to be the beginning of the war, but again, we won't be able to identify the first shot or the first victim. Okay, now we're in the first week. And I think the fighting, if you like to call it like that, will really start with cyber attacks. And there are two elements to that. The first is going to be a software element. So in a further effort to destabilize the population and to disturb or disrupt communication, there will be cyber attacks against really anything unsecured. So the danger isn't so much, cyber attacks against nuclear power stations that blow up. That may come later in the war, but I think the first point of attack really will be the electricity network. It will be the internet in itself, kind of cutting communication lines. So the hacker really will be the first combatants. But then very quickly we will have a hardware element as well of the cyber war. And this will be efforts of trying to shoot satellites down. And I think they're going to be down very quickly. This is something that most people don't really realize, is that modern militaries are incredibly dependent on technology and most importantly satellites. I mean, you all can imagine that a drone, an unmanned aerial vehicle, doesn't fly if it doesn't have GPS coordinates and can't be controlled with a satellite, but even manned aircrafts are basically downed if they don't have satellite communication. And this is something that is going to disproportionately affect medium-sized powers. Because, when you think about it, kind of medium-sized powers are those powers that have tried to modernize their armed forces recently, and so they have all these great new tech, and then the satellites fall down and they can't really use it anymore. Undeveloped powers, on the one hand, they won't have so many tech-reliant things, so they can still fight. And the kind of major powers, so think US, of course they will be majorly hit, but they still got so many other things they can reuse, that they will still be able to fight. And interestingly enough, just as a side note, the US Army is now actually realizing that this could become a problem, and they're training their soldiers in fighting with compasses rather than, GPS and things like that. So they're really realizing that this is a problem. Okay, so these cyber attacks, again, software on the one hand, hardware on the other, will even out the battlefield for a little while. However, I think what's going to be happening very quickly is that civilian companies are going to step in. And that's another kind of important point I want to make. I think that in World War III, one crucial element of future war will be civilian companies doing a lot and playing an important role. And that's actually a change we're already seeing today. So it used to be this cliche that the best kind of tech came out of the military, was invented by and for the military. And a lot of the things, the internet, again, GPS that we use today in everyday life, they were created by the military. This is actually no longer true. So this cliche that you could see the future by looking at what the military has is simply no longer the case. Today, it's private companies that spend so much more money on technological developments compared to the military. And just as an example, looking at drones, this is the kind of thing, that's what I wrote my PhD on and know most about. So drones throughout the decades weren't exclusively military affairs. There really were no civilian drones. And it was in the last 5 years that drones in the civilian realm really took off. And we now have the situations where all the big companies, you know, you've got Apple, you've got Facebook, you've got Google, they're investing millions and billions into drone technology. Which means that the next technological breakthrough here is not going to happen in the military, it's going to happen in the civilian realm. And this is going to influence World War III. So what I think what we're going to see throughout this war is a back and forth between, you know, tech being disrupted and destroyed, and the civilian realm, most importantly, stepping up and developing new stuff. And actually, history has told us that war are moments in which a lot of technological innovation happens. Okay, so now we're getting into the first months of this hypothetical World War III. A lot of how it looks will depend on who fights against whom, you know, whether they're neighboring states or whether there's an ocean in between. But there's one thing we already know, and that's that World War III will be an urban war. This will all be about urban warfare. I mean, I'm not telling you anything new when I say that the world population is urbanizing at rapid rates. By 2050, we expect 70% of the world population to live in cities. So this is where this war will be fought. And that, in fact, is a curse for both sides. So for the attacker, attacking cities is horribly difficult. It gives perfect room for guerrilla fighting. You basically need to clear every house. I mean, we've seen this tragically in Syria and in the fight against ISIS. So this favors, in a way, the defender. But at the same time, if your city is attacked, it's also hugely problematic, because modern cities really work like clockwork. It's basically a very sophisticated systems of different parts working together. And if one part is disrupted, as it of course is in a war, especially with cyber attacks, the whole system breaks down. And you know, if you disrupt the water, you can't just start and drill wells in the city of urban areas. So this is going to be a curse for both sides. So where will this all lead through? Is this going to culminate in something? And I think a lot of people in this room probably want to know, so what about nuclear weapons? So my prediction is they won't be used initially, but they probably are going to be used if the war drags on. Of course, the worst case scenario is that this is where the story ends, we're all dead, nuclear annihilation, and you know, the cockroaches survive. I don't think that that's the most likely scenario. I think humankind is stupid. I don't think we're destroying our planet under us stupid, although not as fast as nuclear weapons. Let's not talk about climate change. But I think nuclear weapons, there are two most likely scenarios how nuclear weapons will be used. The first is not so dissimilar to World War II, meaning, you know, one use of nuclear weapons that ends the fighting, although not the war. I don't think this war is really going to end. I'll come to this in a second. Or an exchange, hopefully one exchange of nuclear weapons where both sides basically get one strike and then the fighting continues nonetheless. Both not pretty scenarios, but not destroying the world. So how will this war that is, you know, defined by this technological back and forth that I described, innovation, counter-innovation, stuff being destroyed, you know, civilian companies stepping in, and this war that's also characterized by fighting in cities, how will this war end? That's probably the most depressing prediction that I have, because I'm not sure it will. I think there's a large probability of this dragging on pretty much forever, and this is actually, again, something that we've already seen. We were just earlier talking about the Afghan war. I mean, this war has been going on forever, really. We started in 2001, we're in 2017. So there's a high chance that some low-level fighting, some last pockets of resistance will continue, I don't want to say forever, but for a very long time. So in the same way that we won't even have a declaration of war, we won't have a peace treaty at the end. Okay, so that was all very uplifting, I realize. But let's think a minute about what does this mean for us. So if, you know, the future defense minister of Poland is in this room, there are 4 things I'd like to recommend if World War III or the future of war really does look like, as I just described. The first, and I hope I made this point clearly, I would recommend not to forget low-tech capability. I mean, it's kind of funny. I spend my days thinking about autonomy in warfare and artificial intelligence in warfare, and I think this is all very exciting. But honestly, in an actual World War III, where you have peer or near-peer competitors that fight against each other, don't neglect, don't discard your low-tech fighting capabilities. This war will be fought on very different fronts, and there may be robot wars on one end, but it will still come down to soldiers fighting against each other, so don't discard this. The second recommendation is prepare your population, and this is really about resilience. I mean, as I mentioned, urban warfare is one of the worst things that can happen to the population. So you need resilience and you need plan Bs. You need to think about what do you do in cases of catastrophes, which, by the way, we should all think about anyway because of climate change, so, good reason to do so even more. The third recommendation has a lot to do with education, and this is about this misinformation campaign that I mentioned at the beginning. Educate or try to educate your population to distinguish between what's real, what isn't, fake news and all that, and we're failing miserably at that at the moment. So again, something that's definitely useful and necessary even if it doesn't come to World War III. And then the last point, and again I'm talking about the population, so you see that my recommendations are very much, not so much for the defense minister only, but for society as a whole. Think about the integration of foreigners, or really, the integration of your society. Think about the cohesion of your society, because one of the dangers that we face really is societies turning against each other, whether it's migrants or someone else. So this is definitely a claim for making societies, trying to make societies more welcoming and integrate people throughout the society more than just tolerate them. And again, this is something we can definitely work on, no matter whether we're going to see a World War III or not. And then, of course, for the politicians, try to avoid World War III in general. There's no reason why we need to fight this. We can solve a lot of things politically, and let's hope that that's where we're headed. And I think I'll stop here, and maybe we can talk about the areas where we think that World War III is going to break out. Although that will also not be particularly uplifting. I'm sorry.
Dziękuję bardzo. Oczywiście.
Thank you very much. Obviously, listening to this introduction, especially the end of it, I was trying to juxtapose this with the policies of our current defense minister. I have no clear conclusions. I understand the weekend teams that reconstruct the historic events are not so dumb after all, differentiating done by the territorial army in Poland. Secondly, telling the difference between fake and true news is certainly very, very critical. Ulrike mentioned that our guests understand and know the regions. Maybe I would like to ask Dr. Patrycja Sasnal first. The Middle East and Africa, the areas that you focus on, do you believe that the developments of the last dozen years or so, do you find an alignment between what's going on there with the futuristic outlook that we've just heard?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's difficult for me to respond how this is in keeping with what Ulrike spoke about. She spoke about a method, or how this will play out, and not the causes, not the reasons, who will be taking part in that. and what part of the population will be affected by what happens, and whether it will happen at all. So before I speak about the Middle East, I must say that I had a problem with World War III, because I understand it's a world war, not just a war. In the Middle East, wars are going on continually. The most horrific war of this millennium, the war in Syria. And I've just come back from Lebanon, and which is neighboring with Syria, as a country that has survived a 15-year civil war, with also some international dominion with the Syrian and Israeli and US troops, and Russia was also taking part. This all came to an end in the 1990s, and Lebanon seems to be quite resilient to the war in Syria, even though there's various attacks, but people are resilient. So I'm thinking now about a world war and how it's different from just a war. A global war, a world war, is one that engages the most important countries or the powers of the world, which are antagonized vis-a-vis each other, or it affects a very meaningful, sizable population of the world. And the Middle East is significant because it seems to be a barometer of the relations between the superpower in the first sense of a global war that is antagonistic between the global powers, like the Cold War. The Cold War, which sort of, I think, changed our understanding of war, but a confrontation between the US and Russia. And I don't know whether this will be the case, but the Middle East had always been sort of a barometer for the relations between those two countries, Russia and the US. And if we look at this dimension in terms of US-Russia relations, the US being quite progressive in their liberal order, being the number one, have come to understand that they shouldn't become involved in the regions, let Russia take it. And this is sort of strengthening Russia. They're capturing more and more, gaining prestige in the world and gaining allies. And so this is in terms of the Middle East and the understanding of war as such. But I need to also respond to what Ulrike said, because I do believe that we are so much under the influence that this will be so different and Ulrike really mentioned the reasons why it will be different. But ladies and gentlemen, are you familiar with Christopher Clark's book, Lunatics, how the First World War started? And everything that you mentioned, disinformation or misinformation for months preceding, there was also this misinformation using ethnic groups in the different countries that was happening. No waging of war, declaration of war for the first summer month, only later on. So all of those triggers, how satellites will be destroyed, will have the very same way of communication as we had in those days back then. So I don't know whether it will be that different, because this is also a part and a parcel of what we are as human beings. And Michał said at one time, Michał was charged that he keeps referring to the last book he read. In other words, his opinion is depending on what was the last book he read. And I must say that I'm under the influence of the last book I read, because now I'm doing MA in philosophy. And I've been reading the political force in Islam, a discussion between Hannah Arendt and Franke, who died in the 80s, and Arendt is really responding to a text that he wrote in the 60s. And Arendt treated this in a very synthetic way. She spoke about force, the use of force, and she said that there's no inclination to use force. Force exists, but it's not related to power, as Arendt understood it. The use of force is juxtaposed to power. Power requires legitimacy, the opinion, and force needs justification. So force is weak in this sense because we identify its outcomes only in the future, while authority or power, which comes from existence of people and coaction in the public space, So to have power and authority, one needs to have that in coexistence and collaboration. And so this is a primary, and the force, use of force is something that we can never tell what the outcomes will be. And that's why it's so dangerous. But what am I really driving at? She said that the use of force is irrational, but it is rational. There's just one moment when it's irrational, and this can sort of push us into a conflict, not even an international conflict, but a domestic conflict that then can be transposed into an international conflict. So the use of irrational force, it's irrational when it's really vis-a-vis a substitute, not somebody that actually has harmed us, but another entity. Let me give you an example. Sally Ann Jones, a British national, in the 1980s, a punk songwriter or a punk singer, leaves the country as a jihadist. 2 years ago, she left to fight in the ranks of the Islamic State. Why? Because the United States started a war in Iraq. So she leaves to be the wife of some guy who possibly cut somebody's throat. And because she believes that what the US had done in Iraq is a great injustice. She's no longer alive. She has been killed by the anti-Daesh coalition. But I give you this example as an example of a substitute instead of finding the right culprit, because then the use of force would be rational. We continue to function in the sphere of irrationality and hypocrisy. Because force becomes the heart of the hypocrisy of the West, because it seems that our world is free of that force, but it's full of it. Either it's between the lines in sports clubs or in the homes or in slaughterhouses. And in the Middle East, you see it more apparently because for the Aital or Harslak, people slaughter animals in the streets, and you see the animals shedding blood. So yes, in a nutshell, speaking about the future war, unfortunately, I think a fraternal war, not among states, but the biggest divisions run inside societies. The Steve Bannon vision, he's not in the White House, but Steve Bannon said that in the world we have two forces fighting each other, the Christians fighting the Muslim and left-wing forces or liberal forces. So Bannon would see the enemy not only in the Muslims, who he doesn't really know, he doesn't know the Muslim world, but he sees also those enemies in his own home. And when the war started in Germany, the war in the 1920s or 30s did not start, well, okay, they conquered Abyssinia, but it wasn't the beginning. They found an enemy in their own home. And this was, I believe, the most dangerous scenario that can be played out in light of a next war. Thank you very much. I believe that Patrycja Sasnal touched a very important issue, a world war that is not global, but among the superpowers, maybe politically incorrect. And Ziemowit Szczerek is focusing on an area that on the one hand has full of differences, tensions, and animosity. And there's a brutal story not that distance ago in terms of relations. But it's also a region that always feels neglected, underappreciated, deceived, betrayed, a region that is not seriously treated. So now let me ask Ziemowit Szczerek, as on the one hand, an author of the Rzeczpospolita Zwycięska, an alternative sort of history of our region, but also of a story, short story on the division of Poland into two parts. So I would like to ask you about two issues. The first, is it true, is it really so, that the European relations, the mutual relations in Central Europe, to be more specific, this sort of fraternal fighting within the scope of the next few years can generate such big tension that they could escalate to an armed conflict. And the second question, which is about the situation in our region. Do you believe that would such a conflict be even meaningful? Because there was a conflict in the Balkans, which was then the beginning of World War I. But is it not like in some opinions that World War III will start in the Ukraine, and that is between the Western and Russian forces, but possibly. And it's quite different that possibly a war would erupt, one war, many sort of prolonged fighting, but this will be insignificant because we're not the heart of the world. We're not a place where everything starts, but possibly a place where the world glimpses every now and then, but it doesn't really have an impact on the global situation. Well, I do believe that it does have an impact. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation, and I am grateful that I can share with you some of my thoughts. And I do believe that the situation here has an impact, and I do believe the scenario for the next war has already been written. It will not happen tomorrow or the day after, but it's what Bannon actually had said, by the way. But let me go to the very beginning. The speculations about war, the anticipation of war by writers, and the senses that follow the course of history, first writing fiction, which then turns to reality. When we speak about Ukraine, the Ukrainian war will not turn into a global war. This is too early because this is not the biggest rift. Not yet. It's part of the rift, but not completely. The Ukrainian conflict was anticipated by Russian-speaking authors. And there were many publications, many books that predicted a sort of Russian pulp fiction about the future conflict. And when you took into account those number of factors that really would impact the origin of conflict, it allowed you to also anticipate the outcome of that conflict. When we speak about our favorite books and the books that we had just completed reading, and I read The People by Dukai quite recently. And in this world where the global conflict had been sort of frozen from this outer space, by peoples who come to the earth. And do remember, we are now living in a situation where conflicts are frozen and defrozen, where the friction, the tectonic plates book back and forth, and then they are frozen in time. This was like also in the Fukuyama piece, and the Yugoslavian situation, where the point of freezing disappears, and then the tectonic plates and all those components that are the building block of the geopolitical crust begin to crush against each other. Historical processes that led to the First World War was frozen, and the protagonist who met Piłsudski sitting in Siberia, who was really unhappy, who expected that World War I should already happen, the War of Nations should have happened, and it's not. And Piłsudski was reading writers, and writers had anticipated this war, and it's not happening, it's not erupting. And I'm not saying only because it's frozen. Today we are now feeling in a period of defrosting, and the time of defrosting after World War I, before World War II, were very short. The League of Nations and the order, the international order, was makeshift, and it wasn't lasting, it wasn't sustainable. One could expect or anticipate that quite soon one would be able to tell how the forces that were defrosted and were decomposing into the global scene, how they would actually impact. And even the Daily Courier in Krakow in 1938 placed an article where they described how most probably the next world conflict would look. And so, of course, today we hear that this is not possible, that anybody who speaks about a conflict is a warmonger. But one nonetheless anticipated, saying that first it's Russia with Germany, and then they will jump at each other's throats, and then there will be Western allies. And the Germans will not be able to withstand this pressure from all sides, and they will be conquered. And how far can the Russians go, how far the Allied forces can go, and how Europe would be divided. So really, apart from minor issues, at that publication in 1938, this was actually quite precisely described how actually Europe ended after World War II. So now we are facing this defrosting. Yesterday we had the opening session. Is it really worth saving Western democracies? Yes, it is worthwhile, because today this is the only freezer that can stop us from this tectonic plates moving in the crust of the world. And I do hope that this is possible, though I do have my doubts. I think the fuel for this freezer has now been used up, and it's not clear where we can find more fuel for it. So, of course, what will be the sort of scenario of that new conflict? Bannon spoke about it, Trump spoke about it. I am concerned that in the Anglo-Saxon alliance against the German-French domination of the continent, if there are populists still at the helm, if it is not possible to reinstate Western democracy, where the European Union and the unity of the European Union is really of paramount importance. And this is something that I would wholeheartedly welcome. And as Ulrike said at the very beginning, it is great that the Poles and Germans can sit down together and speak about World War III, sitting down at the same table. And to hope that this never happens again. But should this all move toward this populist scenario, should it all move toward this nationalistic resurrection of strategic centers, well, then we'll see, the outline of future conflict. And this Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American fear of domination of Europe by a single European economic power is nothing new. The United Kingdom always tried to divide Europe in order not to ensure that continental Europe doesn't become too strong. And today we have a very simplified, vulgar vision of international policies, where Trump claims Germany is his geopolitical enemy and not Russia. Bannon speaks about the united forces, maybe not united, but the forces of the left wing and Islam. And as we spoke about earlier, the war really starts by looking at your enemy within, but there can also be an enemy where the banner of ideology is being raised. So if in Bannon's or Trump's eyes it's Germany and France, the residue of liberal Europe, holds the banner of liberalism and left-wing ideology, they compounded with this imaginary economic geopolitical threat, they become the embodiment of enemy, and this rift is continuing. And I feel that everything will become clear in a few years' time with the next wave elections, where we know who's going to be in power in US, whether FP will not be even stronger in Germany than they are right now. What will be the situation in the UK, the Netherlands? who will be at the helm in Poland and in Central Europe as such. So we'll see whether there is progress or whether this thawing or unfreezing is progressing. I would like to be an optimist, but I'm more pessimistic. On top of that, there's Russia, who's trying to regain its position in the international arena. And I feel that this is a move striving to, well, it's like another phase, if you will, of rejecting colonialism. But we're not speaking here about a pure form of colonialism. We're speaking here about cultural or civilizational colonialism. Russia is claiming that their vision of reality, like Poland or Hungary, is equal to the Western vision. The Crimea, Syria were pounding of the fist on the table and saying, listen, we are a worthy partner for discussion, and we want to be part of that discourse. And if one creates this opposition between Germany, France, the hardcore of the European Union. We cannot hear speaker from the room. But yes, of course, we can continue to speak about this, of course. But I would like to leave it aside for the time being. Paradoxically, what's more important in China is Japan and Turkey, possibly. And I'm here referring to this famous essay by Friedman, who anticipated this rift, and which was discussed in Poland because of the sort of Middle Sea. And I think that this is really fiction, because Poland will not create such a structure. Because countries will always choose Germany as the more attractive ally than Poland, even if Poland is to be this embodiment of Western signals. But most probably they would prefer to remain independent and sort of sitting fence sitting between the main players. So there's no reason for them to be declare themselves on one side or the other. So I do feel that this conflict will not be particularly affecting them. But I am concerned that in such a situation, Poland will declare itself on the side of the Anglo-Saxon countries and will be then wedged between Russia and the German-French bloc. However, as I said, this doesn't need to happen. All that I'm describing, this future geopolitical structure, will become known with the next wave of elections, and when we are able to see what path the countries will choose. Maybe I'll end with this. Patrycja, well, just to respond to what Ziemowit said, the scenario that you're writing seemed to be more likely, let's say 6 months ago, than today. Somebody from the room asked about China. I don't know whether you will agree with this summary. I don't want to try to summarize what you said, but this vision of the Trump administration, well, maybe not even the Trump administration, Trump himself and people from who had been close to him, Finn and Bannon, well, it was clear what was the place assigned to Russia and China. Russia was to be an ally because Russia was. And it seems Trump still thinks this, and Bannon definitely thinks this. While corrupt and so on and so forth, Russia nonetheless is a defender of traditional Christian values. It's an ally in the civilizational conflict, while China is an enemy. Enemy that is taking advantage of us in an economic sense. Manipulating currencies. So this is like duality in the administration, in the U.S. administration, even though today Jim Mattis, Secretary of Defense, and General McMaster, National Security Advisor, these are people who definitely will not sacrifice the alliance with Germany. For them, U.S. relations are the most important. And they realize this, contrary to these ideological people like Bannon. Trump, I don't know whether he was really part of any of those camps. He's quite a specific individual. But I do believe that duality exists in the administration because you have Peter Navarro, for example. Peter Navarro responsible for international trade and all those matters which pertain to U.S. foreign trade or commerce. And Navarro wasn't very clear when he spoke about Germany. He said, oh, we'll see whether Germans are not manipulating currencies. We'll wait and see what's the next Treasury report, how Germany will be classified. So Germany is actually one of the 6 countries that need to be on the watch list, and where things are not all that transparent and clear. So in the US, I would actually try to see whether these voices will not be on a collision course, whether you do not come to a point where you need to choose, whether Mattis wins, and he doesn't want to destroy the good relations with Germany, or others win.
I am totally proud of myself because I've been able to provoke an expert who evades speculations like these, and you wouldn't do it, would you, anywhere, anytime, if it wasn't for my thick line that I used to delineate this reality. It is vulgarly thick, the line, and this is why I told you about the sort of the biggest, fattest arrows which are used to sort of depicting the vectors of the reality to be forecasted. So I had to be blunt about this. And last point, it may go this or that way, like in the Russian case. Maybe we should work with China and play havoc on the West, or should we be in alliance with Trump against China? This is not decided in Russia, is it? So it may go either way. What is important, however, is that the defreezer has started to act, so the melting mechanism is triggered. Now we're wondering here whether the most dangerous source of war is an internal conflict, a civil war, or is it perhaps that countries will fall in conflict between themselves? It probably depends on where the voters will make their countries go, and it sort of depends on the ideologies that will prevail. But I was first mainly intrigued by Ulrike Esther Franke saying that in the opening statement that states controlling the armies are no longer in the job of controlling the most progressive technologies. It's not DARPA or a government agency will create the most progressive technological inventions. It'll be the civilian companies that obviously got rich because they had state sponsorship, but they are rich enough now to be independent, and they can engage in very progressive R&D. Now, the point that technology is outside of the control of the state, this is not a controversial point, I suppose. This is clear that private sector operators are actually creating technologies that will make or break the future. But my question is, are private companies, are big corporations becoming political entities? Can they trigger a conflict? Because we talk China, Russia, the US, maybe not one between countries, but inside. Maybe this is no longer a relevant discussion in the first place. Maybe, just put things simply, it may be a war between Google and Amazon, against Amazon.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to have a war between... I don't think we're going to have a war between Google and Amazon, or I mean, certainly not between those two, but also not between Google, Amazon on the one side and any other corporation on the other. I mean, I guess the biggest difference between companies and states when it comes to that is that, yes, companies are increasingly becoming political actors and they may cause conflict, but they have very little interest in causing war. And I'm very well aware that this argument has been made about countries as well, the whole kind of end of war because it's not economically beneficial. So we need to be careful with this, but companies only work on economic benefit. So for them, a war is almost always bad. Of course, you could say, you know, armament companies gain from war. But yeah, I think it's an important point to say that companies are becoming more important political actors. And I mean, we've seen with Mark Zuckerberg possibly running for presidency soon, that leaders of companies can be very important. But I think this is more about conflict than war, really. And maybe, can I make one point? Because I thought it was a really interesting scenario about, you know, the kind of Anglo-American alliance versus the French-German liberals or something like that. So I have a French-German background but lived in the UK for the last 5 years, so I'm kind of in between this. And I think it's a very interesting point, and I think you may be right. However, I think we may be thinking slightly wrong in the way that we only think of nation states, but I think when it comes to this particular conflict that you mentioned between kind of liberalism and I don't know, illiberalism, regions and cities play much more important roles. Namely, that this conflict that you mentioned, that's definitely there, isn't so much between, let's say, the US, the UK against France and Germany, but rather between London, California, Berlin against Saxony, England, Wales, and you know where I'm going.
Robert Kaplan is working on such vision right now.
Say again?
Robert Kaplan is working on such theory right now.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you, well, we had this theme of telling the difference between power and violence, and I would like to bring it a bit more closer to home from the intellectual heights. And I would like to suggest that perhaps when military power is one of many types of instruments of political power in the first place, and the only country that is the biggest superpower, political and superpower in terms of economy, it's the United States. In all the other superpowers are no longer both. We have the superpower, economic power, China and Germany. Germany is militarily weak, and China is so-and-so. Russia is a military superpower, not an economic one. And speaking of Germany, and speaking of Poles and Germans being able to talk about the Third World War, Radek Sikorski once said in Bundestag he was more worried about the lack of activity of Germany on the global or European scene than he would. And I would probably the Polish Polish defense minister in Bundestag could say that. He would say to Bundestag, he could say to Bundestag that he was worried by the weakness of Bundeswehr. He'd rather have a more powerful Bundeswehr. So that's a little parallel. The question: Can military conflict be triggered by descending rather than emerging powers, such as Russia? Or if you look at the potential of China, a big military conflict doesn't make sense for them because they have so much advantage in capital and, you know, money surplus or exchange of goods. You know, they in the military field they do not seem to have the same big upper hand. So maybe the war will be the weapon of the weak, like terrorism was against more powerful states. Maybe war will be like terrorism, especially the hybrid war. This may be the basic instrument used by the weaker ones, not the countries, not the powers on the box, but those who are ranked lower. I don't suppose you could identify a category of countries that would use warfare, hybrid warfare more readily. The Taxnet virus that attacked the Iranian centrifuges in nuclear plants has not been designed by descending or de-emerging countries, but by the US and Israel, most probably. Basically, the methodology that Ulrike described is changing because, you know, physical tools, the devices are changing. You know, these are evolving, but that's a small change. That's a trivial change. You know, chemical weapons. Now, chemical warfare is the weapon of weak countries, right? Of poor countries, because they cannot afford nuclear. I don't know. Terrorism, I wouldn't discredit. I wouldn't write it off. That's the word. I would discredit it completely, but I wouldn't write it off. I wouldn't even use the word discredit because this is more complicated. But there will be more and more of terrorism. But this is the famous thesis of Olivier Roy. Islam is not becoming more radical. It's Islamization of radicalism, rather. Islamization of radicalism is the name of the game, and we have been radical for centuries. And jihadism as an ideology that combines the dream of revolution, the sense of fraternity, moral supremacy, and the community beyond races and languages, because that's what it is actually responding to globalized world. Let me mention migrations. Michał, you seem to be worried that the weaker countries will use this old methodology of warfare. It appears that political violence has this characteristic. If it's irrational, it spirals, it cascades, which is the most important, which is the most dangerous aspect. For example, and let me assume, if it wasn't for the Russian aggression in Crimea, if the Middle East was more peaceful, if there was no war in Syria, I'm not sure if European states would have started the European Defence Fund. I'm not sure Europe would have switched on the PESCO mechanism, a military cooperation vehicle, if it wasn't for that aggression over there. So immigration is part and parcel of the spiral quite seamlessly, to be honest, and they are becoming this trigger. You know, Duke Ferdinand's assassination was a trigger, right? That sort of trigger I'm talking about. And the crisis of 2015 showed it clearly that migration can be a trigger of violence because an army is sent to the border. European border guards, you know, is formed, and Frontex is getting new responsibilities. So there's more and more militarism in the air, and migration is coming. Migration, there will be more of it in the short term because there are conflicts in our closest neighborhood, and totalitarian regimes are the push power, and the population imbalance. Africa will be 40% of the world, and Europe will be 7% of the world. Finally, climate change. Life will become unbearable in Africa soon, and people will have to move somewhere, and we're completely unprepared for that. There are no political leaders who would be preparing their populations to diversity. And this is an excellent value added to what's going on in Germany, France, and Scandinavia. They are the only countries that are doing this. Angela Merkel is the only political leader who has this far-sighted vision. There's no stopping that. So let's be prepared earlier than later. Now we hide our heads in sand, and we are pretending that the world doesn't exist. So to cut a long story short, irrational force, irrational violence is a spiral. If there is some violence in a liberal environment, there will be exponentially more in the non-democratic environment, non-liberal environment rather. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've got about 20 minutes. I see 3 questions, you and you and you. I'd like to use a shorter time distance because you seem to be looking forward 50 years or 30 years. What are generals saying today? US generals are quite open about this. The arrangements between Brezhnev and Nixon have stabilized nuclear potentials of these countries, making war unprofitable for both parties. And the US generals are saying that you can bypass it very quickly. We have such a technological advantage that we have created so much conventional power that will prevent the use of nuclear weapons by Russia. We can attack Russia, making it impossible for Russia to even launch the nuclear rockets. What are the Russian generals saying? They are saying, we know you're preparing for that. Don't even think that we can allow this. Let's go back to 1913. Germany knew that the Tsar Russia would have power enough to attack, and 1914 is a meaningful year. So in 10 years we will not win. We have equilibrium now. So if you look at military journals today, does it pay off to attack America when we have equilibrium, or should we wait until they have an advantage? Last year in the summer, the Chinese leader offered a pact to Russia to prevent an internal civil war. The Russians rejected it. Nobody spoke about it, and in the Chinese diplomacy, to say something out in the open, what you normally think, was a sign of determination. The Russians said, we're not interested in an alliance with you. So we have developments which are, within years, 5 to 10 years, which are more dangerous than the future projections. Now, thank you very much for the interesting scenarios that you covered. They were focused on geopolitical aspects, and I'm happy that migration was added because I was thinking about this issue throughout the entire discussion. You were sort of looking at where the conflicts might happen and who's going to have a bigger tank. We know that hybrid wars don't really need tanks, but that's not the point. The point is that migration is a critical part. And as you said, there will be more and more migration. Let me expand this, however. This will not just mean migration from developing countries into Europe. Let's look at migration more broadly, from the countryside to cities. And generally, technology will make migrations and mobility easier. And there will be many reasons why people may want to move: climate and other push factors. However, in the meantime, during the migration crisis, we have a major political conflict in Europe, but nothing has happened. Europe can actually handle 2 million people, no problem. Now, what happens if, and I'd like to ask you about your views on the scenario, what happens if robots and devices will replace humans as workforce? We may see a revolution that will no longer be comparable to industrial or information revolution. There will be no jobs for unskilled people. Maybe there will be no jobs for the majority of the population on the planet. Maybe job will be a privilege, and no utopia can handle this, because both capitalism and communism and socialism are based on the ethos of work and the position of work in society. So if we have a huge mass of people, not migrants, let's call them wasted lives as described by Zygmunt Bauman. Can this be the biggest source of conflict in the 21st century? And secondly, how can we defend against this? Because the only weapon that we might have in Europe is the guaranteed basic income. But that's the logic of humanitarian aid and the work camp. You have no job, you have to be sustained. But that's not the society that we know, and that's the society that we want. So maybe this is going to be the biggest source of conflict, not a Russian tank. Let me just say that this is a scenario in Crooks, by the way, and it ended badly. And when guys go to war, ladies will not go to factories, because factories will not be needed. I have 3 points or questions. First, to Ulrike, the balance is based on the second strike capacity. There's always an opportunity to retaliate. But there were only 5 countries that would have nuclear weapon, and this absurd gave us security. Does this thing exist today? Not knowing the And now the second point. We always think in terms of the beginning of war and the end of war, but we may slide into a situation where we don't know whether the war is on or not. I think we've had this situation in Estonia, where the country was digitally attacked, and we don't know who actually destroyed the centrifuges in Iran. We are assuming or presuming it's the Americans or the Israeli. But we tend to use the word probably too often. When there's a hack on the banking system, it's probably the Chinese. But it can be anyone. Malta, a group of 20 people who are crazy and who want to play havoc. But we always assume, and we always have probably. Last, and I've had this conviction for a long time now, the biggest problem is that there is a discrepancy between humanitarian and social capacities. We don't have European leadership. Show me one state. Everyone admires Merkel, but she has a different reputation inside Germany. Look at Trump. He wields an improbable power, but having such a low IQ, it's obscene that such people have power more than the entire globe. It's awkward that we have this situation. Like, on the other hand, we have technological capabilities that are growing and growing, and the biggest players, the Googles and Amazons, who have higher turnover than the GDP in Ukraine. Are we close to discussing redistribution again? I don't know how to solve it. I am surprised that we live in quiet times still, but it may change in any second. Okay, what is the solution? So what is the solution? I agree with you that if you look at how fragile the foundation of our stability is resting on, you're right. I have one statement per each comment. Sliding into war, more or less, sometimes more, sometimes less. I agree, there will be no declaration of war. These declarations are not used Israel and Lebanon, for example, they have no peace. As far as we can hear, there's a state of emergency in France for a year now. I understand your point. So this is a gray zone until there are people killed in the West. We will not notice the war. We will not acknowledge there is a war going on. But what you said, we should talk about casualties. There are no wars, but people die in thousands. In Syria, for example, there's a war going on and 20 countries are engaged one way or the other. But they have not declared war on each other. No, they haven't. That's a weird state. As far as the statesmanship, I believe that Merkel is a statesman or woman. I'm not sure about Macron, but he has potential. but not many of them. And I do agree, there's not much leadership. And this is a great area, politics. You can shape people's attitudes, and it is the current attitudes that are shaped are really bad. I mean, leaders have to have something to shout. Leaders have to have a standard, a flag, liberal or otherwise. What flag can we use if everything has been diluted and withered? It's not withered and diluted, but maybe the population believes it's withered and diluted. Let me give you an example. Giving up religiousness is a major mistake on the left, because ever since people have existed, they have always been religious, this way or that way or whatever. They might believe in Beyoncé and believe she's a goddess, or Allah, or God. Trump. You mentioned Trump. Such a low IQ on such a position. But look at how resilient the American institutions are. This is fascinating. Maybe you shouldn't look at these individuals, but also at the institutions. If they have power, if they can support people and their opinions, if they have power, they operate so well, and they can inhibit such craziness. Maybe the next election will see the trajectory, but I still am positive. Migration, lack of jobs, and sort of long-term trends, maybe in the very long run, this may be a big problem, but Europe needs labor, needs work. I mean, all indicators show, if you travel across Germany, I'm not sure if you have the same impression, there are so many old people in Germany and in Austria and elsewhere. They are sitting in restaurants and pubs in the evening. Usually, well, this is beautiful, but this means we are aging. And Poland is aging, so we need work. But Kaya talked about robots and robotization, and we do not have an answer. Sorry, interpreters can't hear the comment. It's off mic, I'm sorry.
It was that robotization is not the problem only of Europe.
No i potem jeszcze jest druga strona.
And then we have the development aid, the other side of the coin. To countries, I'm talking about countries which are still underdeveloped, and research shows that development aid is working often. And you have to be wise and smart about it, of course, but you can't give it up, can you? You have to build your own resilience, you know, a buzzword in Europe recently, but this is a wise idea. Let's not discuss without the microphone. And Russia, China. If I understood you correctly, can there be a conflict between Russia and China? I'm sorry, you can't speak off mic, sorry. Let me just make sure. Let me make sure that I'm talking about the right line. Russia, China, okay. Russia has a major problem with China. Russia has 3 borders, demographic one, 3 borders and 3 big problems and potential conflict in the future. In the east, a demographic conflict with the Chinese. The Chinese can overwhelm Russia with the population. Cultural conflict down in the south with Islam. And the psychological or mental problem with the West, the all-eternal. So Russia is afraid of China. I'm not sure what proposal you're referring to from China to Russia. I don't suppose Oh, the Shanghai Defense Organization? Anyway, they are collaborating as long as it beneficial, but in the long term, these other religions are like mirrors. They are excellent because I can see myself in them as if it was a mirror. I can understand what my Polishness is all about, or your Germanness is all about, or Frenchness is all about. So you can't... I'm not sure if it's Polishness, you know, Polishness. Maybe it's not that simple. All right, let me try to put a final line on it. I am not sure myself either what type of identity it is, the one which comes from the intermarriage idea, even though I had a moment where I was kind of interested in that. It's an attractive concept for the Galician fraction in Amatorska Cafe, and political analysts from Kiev to Mars Seashores, New Haven, and Timothy Snyder's New Haven as well. Back to the topic. I'm not sure if we have resolved the question where conflict may come from, but let me paraphrase Albert Einstein, who said that he doesn't know which means will be used in the Third World War, but certainly the Fourth World War will be fought with stones and bats. So we will be left with a Mad Max type of vision of little tribes fighting their little wars in an empty desert. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for perseverance, for coming, for interesting discussions. This conference has been organized with the Open Society Foundation, Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, and the European Council on Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Relations, I'm sorry. And the key organizers came from the Institute of Advanced Studies. Thank you very much.